Yes, sir! Toronto Raptors news, boys. The Raptors have done it again with Gary Trent Jr., boys. Now, what do I mean when I say this? Hopefully my phone doesn't fall down. I'm chilling in the car right now. I have it set up in a very ghetto way. I'm hoping for the best. If it falls down, just bear with me, boys. Now, why do I say the Raptors have done it again? Couple of reasons. But first of all, what do I mean by this? When I say the Raptors have done it again, I mean that the Raptors have once again found a young potential piece that they can put into their core for the future. The same way we've done with Pascal Siakam, same way we've done with OG, same way we've done with Van Vliet and Chris Boucher. We found another young piece to be a part of our organization for the future with Gary Trent Jr. I've seen a lot of Raptors fans with mixed feelings on the Norman Powell trade. Some people thought it was a bad trade. Me, I make no bones about it, boys. I love the Gary Trent Jr. trade. I think Gary Trent Jr. is a much better piece for us in the long term than a guy like Norman Powell. Norman Powell's been with us for years. I love storming Norman. I'm going to miss him. But Gary Trent Jr., boys, he's just an overall better player. When we compare Gary Trent Jr. to Norman Powell, they have a lot of the same skill sets, boys. Norman Powell, he's a great shooter, great creator, great attacker, great slasher. Same thing with Gary Trent Jr. Gary Trent Jr. can shoot, he can dribble, he can pass, he can create his own shot, what else? He can defend. The thing that makes Gary Trent Jr. better than Norman Powell, in my opinion, is that he's a better defender than Norman Powell ever was. And he's still 6 years younger than Norman Powell. Gary Trent Jr. is only 22 years old, boys. He has a long future ahead of him. He has come nowhere near his prime yet. He has a lot of development to go through. A man like Norman Powell is now in his prime, playing the best basketball of his career. For the Raptors, we have a long-term outlook. None of our players are in their true prime right now, except for Kyle Lowry. So we have a future outlook. For the Blazers, it makes sense because they have Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum in their primes. They're trying to win now. For us, we're trying to win in the future over the next couple of years, develop our guys. OG has not hit his prime yet. Pascal has not hit his prime. Fred is probably going to be entering his prime over the next couple of years. So I think it makes sense for us to go with a guy like Gary Trent Jr., who's a lot younger, 6 years younger, and is a much better defender, boys. So why do I say that the Raptors have done it again with Gary Trent Jr.? As I told you, he's 6 years younger than Powell. We got Hood in the trade as well. Hood, he's okay. He's on a final year of his contract, so he's expiring this year. I'm not too worried about it, but we got Gary Trent. We're going to sign him in the free agency this summer to a long-term contract. Probably something similar that we would have had to pay to Norman Powell. Probably something in the $15 to $20 million per year range. So not too bad for a guy like Gary Trent Jr., who's going to be a part of the future for a long time. So now moving on, boys. What was the difference? I forgot to mention this key point, boys. Gary Trent Jr., a video came out, the Raptors released with Gary Trent Jr. And he said for the first time in the past 3 years of his career, he actually feels wanted. He actually feels wanted. His quote says, "For the first time in my career in the last 3 years, I feel wanted," boys. Now, why does he say this, boys? Because when he was with the Blazers, the difference between him on the Blazers and the difference between him on the Raptors is this simply. He was playing behind future Hall of Famers in CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard and Carmelo Anthony. He was playing behind future Hall of Famers, 3 future Hall of Famers. So in the starting unit, he would get shots taken away because Damian Lillard is a better player than him. CJ McCollum is a better player than him. Coming off the bench, he's getting shots taken away from him by Melo because Melo, you know, he's a volume shooter. He's going to get a lot of shots up. And with limited minutes coming off the bench, there's not many shots to go around. So on the Blazers, Gary Trent Jr. never really felt, and he said this out his mouth, he never really felt like he was a part of their long-term plans. He wasn't really given the opportunity to go out there and just play basketball. With the Raptors, he said out his own mouth, he feels like he's going to be a part of this team's future, and they actually want him. With the Gary Trent Jr., the difference is the Raptors actually see Gary Trent Jr. as a part of their core, a part of their young core going into the future. Boy, I am sitting in the car right now. I'm in fucking Brampton, and I'm sweating like shit. I'm in fucking Bramladash, as the racist people call it, but I'm sweating hard as hell, boys. I hope you don't mind. I'm fucking sweating. But back to what I was saying. Gary Trent Jr. with the Raptors, we see him as part of our long-term core going into the future, whereas the Blazers just saw him as a young potential piece, but they didn't have the money, the free agency cap space to keep this guy because they already are paying contracts to Nurkic, Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, Robert Covington, Derrick Jones Jr., so they didn't have enough free agency cap space to keep a guy like Gary Trent Jr., even though they did have his bird rights. I guess they just didn't feel comfortable doing so. They'd rather get a guy like Norman Powell, but I digress, boys. So what can we say about Gary Trent? As I said, he can score, he can create, he can shoot, he can dribble, he can pass, he can defend. He does pretty much everything you want. He has that dog mentality, like he's not a pushover. He gives me the same vibe. I think him and OG Anunoby are going to get along really well. They've already been posting each other on social media. They get along really well. I think him and OG are going to be good friends. Just like OG and Ibaka used to be good friends. I think that OG and Gary Trent will be good friends. He has a very good energy about him. I like him. Same thing, random fact about Gary Trent Jr. I think a lot of us know this, but he's Gary Trent Jr. His father, Gary Trent Sr., he also played the first 3 years of his career for the Portland Trail Blazers. And then in the 4th year of his career, he was traded to the Raptors on his 40th game, just like Gary Trent Jr. was. So both him and his father had the same career trajectory for the first 4 years. That's just a fun fact about Gary Trent. But what does this news mean for the Blazers, boys? This news that Gary Trent Jr. did not feel wanted and did not feel like he was a part of their future. Well, the news, what it means for the Blazers and the Blazers fans is the Blazers fans are probably going to be a bit hurt by this, because I know a lot of Blazers fans like Gary Trent Jr. They missed him when he left. They were sorry to see him go. They had plans for him in the future. A lot of Blazers fans were sad about it. So this news for them is really going to be a shot to the gut. It's not going to feel great. It never feels good for a player that you supported for years to come back and then say to you that he felt like he wasn't really wanted. That's kind of like a slap in the face. So I can understand that. What does this news mean for the Raptors, boys? This is great news for us. It means that Gary Trent Jr., he's happy where he's at. He hasn't even experienced what the real Toronto home crowd is like. Once we bring this guy back to Toronto, he gets into Scotiabank Arena. He hears the crowd roaring, because that Scotiabank Arena, we have one of the top 5 loudest arenas in the NBA, if not in sports. But I'm exaggerating when I say in sports, but definitely top 5 in the NBA. Gary Trent Jr., once he feels that energy, once he comes to Toronto, feels the fans really embrace him, he's going to be ready to lock in for a long time. Hopefully we can lock him into a long-term deal this summer. I like our team right now, boys. We got OG, we got Fred, we got Gary Trent Jr., we got Pascal, we got Boucher, and Kyle Lowry, the whole Kyle Lowry situation. I'm going to make a video about this closer towards the offseason, and we're going to talk about what the Raptors are going to do in free agency, boys. Anyways, let me know, like, what are y'all thoughts on this news that Gary Trent Jr. finally feels like he's wanted after spending 3 years with the Blazers? He's come to the Raptors and he finally feels like he's wanted by us. He feels like he's wanted by a team for the first time in his career. That's great news for me as a Raptors fan, because I like Gary Trent Jr. What are your thoughts on it, boys? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a discussion about it. I want to know how you guys feel about Gary Trent Jr. as a player, how you guys feel he'll fit with the Raptors long term, and how you guys feel about this news that he didn't feel wanted with the Blazers. I'm sweating like a pig, boys. I'm out of here. Enjoy the rest of your day. Happy Saturday, boys. It's 20 degrees right now. All right, peace.